How are you doing, Fergal? Thanks for joining the podcast today.
Jack, my privilege, and thank you for asking. It's always quite flattering when somebody does those kind of things. It has been a busy day, and in fact, it's been a quite a busy week and quite a busy few weeks.
Yeah, well, I'm always seeing you pop up on social media fighting for our rivers, which is fantastic to see that because it might seem a little bit peculiar for some people to see the lead man of the Undertones is a fanatic river conservationist. And I think it's fair to say a chalkstream champion. So where did this passion for rivers come from?
um, well, I did. Obviously, just to clarify, I've been accused of lots of things in my life, but never none of those before, I have to say, Jack.
Oh, I
The
think you've
passion
earned it.
the passion's a very, very straightforward one. I began developing an interest in fly fishing back in Ireland when I was 10, 11, maybe 12 years old, something like that. It's important perhaps to bear in mind in an Irish context, and particularly the northwest of Ireland, access to things like salmon and trout and sea trout, certainly in the early mid 1970s, it's very universal. It's on everybody's doorstep. The cost of licenses and permits is fairly low by comparative standards. So it was not a particularly unusual hobby or pastime for a young man to be taking up. That obviously fast forwards probably 50 years when I became chairman of a little old club called the Amwell Magna Fishery, which is the oldest fly fishing club in England, still standing fishing the same stretch of water after almost 180 years. And
Wow.
that brought me into direct, up close and personal contact with not only the River Lee itself in Hertfordshire, but more generically rivers throughout the south and southeast of England.
So, unlike, say, that in England, for example, you tend to associate salmon and trout fishing with more the upper class. So in Ireland, it's not the same. Then it's more of a
Uh,
everyone can have a go at it.
Ironically enough, until I came to this country, I never understood why anybody wanted to go coarse fishing.
Oh, right.
Such was the level of my naivety and the lack of education. Because in Ireland, certainly at that point through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and possibly still to an extent today, everybody went fishing for salmon and trout. There was no reason on earth that you would want to go and sit uh, by a canal, few that we have in Ireland, to catch a roach,
Yeah.
because you could just get on your bike, cycle over into Donegal. There was any number of salmon rivers, and you stood a reasonably good prospect of going home that evening with a small gristle of some kind.
Yeah. So yeah, I can understand if you've got that much salmon fishing, you definitely have a go with it. So when you're on tour, then would you have a rod packed away? Would you kind of fish a
Uh,
little bit?
I didn't through that period of my life.
No.
I was clearly too busy involved in rock and roll. Uh,
I guess yeah. When you've got that, then it's probably to forgive you to kind of get stuck into the other
if
stuff.
if you're asking me, did later in my life, as my career evolved and changed, did I, for example, on one occasion, accept a speaking engagement to give the keynote address at a conference in North America on the subject of copyright? And did something that persuade me to walk out of my office in London and go all the way to North America may have had something to do with the limestone rivers in Pennsylvania, which I had never fished before. Clearly, I would suggest that's a scurrilous accusation. I'd have to deny that I ever
Yeah.
contemplated such a thing. So later in my life, absolutely, I accepted meetings and speaking engagements at conferences on behalf of the British music industry, clearly unattracted to the idea that I would be a couple of hours away from the Blue Mountains in southeastern Australia, or indeed Pennsylvania in the northwest of America, and on and on and on.
I always try and keep not that I ever dust it off, but I always try and keep a rod in the car if I am working away, just in case you get an hour, because it is
Very
nice to
sensible
just,
idea.
Yeah, I think so. Do you, is it only fly you do, or do you fish for everything now, or is it just fly predominantly?
It's still fly fishing.
Yeah, okay.
Because of the way my life developed, I'm afraid I genuinely, and it's probably quite a sad thing to be saying, I genuinely would know my way around a float setup if someone actually would have to sit there and put the whole rig together for me. And as for bottom feeders, I hear about these things, but I've actually no idea what it involves or what it's.
No, fair enough. There's actually quite a thriving culture of people fly fishing for coarse fish now in the UK. You know, a lot of people target things like chub and roach on the fly, and it's becoming more popular. I don't know if it'll overtake salmon anytime soon, but people are giving it a go.
We catch quite a few of them at the Alma Magna fishery.
Oh,
We've
okay.
got quite a good, healthy population of coarse fish, along with the brown trout. And it's not uncommon to catch little dace and chub and all kinds of things will come up and grab at the fly.
Yeah, they obviously don't know it's not real, do they? So they're going to gobble it up.
Well, I believe it was a little man called Isaac Walton said, "Is it not an art to deceive a trout with a fly? A trout."
Exactly. Yeah, they're pretty switched on to it. Chalk streams are such a unique habitat, and I keep seeing different percentages, but everywhere you look, it's somewhere between 80 and 90% of them are in England. In the entire world, we've got most of them. It's our Great Barrier Reef. Yeah. So what is it that makes them so special?
It's quite simply that layer of chalk. That's the clues in the title, as they say.
Yeah.
It's not exclusively, but you'll deal with the complaints. There is a band of chalk that pretty much, not 100%, but pretty much slams into the Norfolk coast, runs diagonally across the south and southeast of England, and disappears again into the English Channel, somewhere round about the south of Hampshire, Dorset, and reappears in northern France in a little enclave in Normandy. It is that layer of chalk that makes the White Cliffs of Dover white and creates the Needles, and indeed gives the name to the Isle of Wight, and indeed creates Salisbury Plain, and that whole landscape is that layer of chalk. Now, what it actually does is when it rains, that chalk absorbs the water and then provides the best natural water filter nature has ever invented. And that water that falls as rain will eventually reappear from springs and fissures in that chalk, anything from weeks, months, decades, and in some cases even anything up to 100 years later. Now, bearing in mind, it's now just been filtered through this incredible organic natural filter. So what comes out of these springs is the clearest water you've ever seen. In a proper chalk stream, you can sit there and count every pebble, even in 6, 7, 8, 10 feet of water. Because it's coming out of a massive underground reservoir, the chalk aquifer, it comes out at a reasonably constant rate. So they shouldn't, in theory, fluctuate very much in response to rains and storms and floods. It should be a relatively consistent level of flow. And ironically enough, at or near enough 10 degrees centigrade. It doesn't matter if it's 3 feet of snow outside, a chalk stream should be right about 10 degrees centigrade. It really doesn't matter if it's about 20 degrees outside, the chalk stream should round about be about 10 degrees centigrade. Now, there's exceptions to all of those rules, but generically speaking, this phenomenally pure source of water at a reasonably constant rate of supply at a reasonably constant temperature. And you've now just created the perfect ecosystem for life to thrive and develop.
They are, you know, if you've never seen a chalk stream, I suppose people, it's not like there's a sign next to every chalk stream saying this is a chalk stream, but if you've never seen one, they are absolutely incredible habitats. And I'm going to try not to trigger you, but it's been quoted that rivers have never been cleaner. But as me and you well know, for lack of a better word, a lot of them are still open sewers. And in fact, a lot of lowland English rivers are classed as poor by the Water Framework Directive still. So I know you could go on and on, but I'll try and distill this down. So what are the major issues of chalk streams at the moment?
Well, one of the things that's been keeping me busy today is, as part of the Water Framework Directive, every 4 years, the Environment Agency and DEFRA government are charged with publishing an updated status report on water bodies in England. It looks only specifically in England. So I can tell you here today that the overriding goal of the Water Framework Directive was that 100% of rivers would reach good surface water status by 2015. Here we are 5 years later.
Yeah.
There is not one single river in England that reaches good overall surface water status. That's generically brought about by two components. One is the ecological makeup of the river, the fish, the invertebrates, and all that kind of good stuff. 86% of rivers in England do not qualify as good ecological status.
Wow.
The second component of that is chemical status, and there is not a single river in England that meets good chemical status. It's a train wreck from one end to the other, and the Environment Agency have been overseeing and responsible for delivering the objectives of that piece of legislation for the last 17 years.
So what is the, I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? What's the solution? I mean, is there any light at the end of the tunnel for this sort of thing, or is that kind of a bit fanciful?
Well, it's actually, ironically enough, it's not fanciful.
No.
All that actually needs to happen is for the Environment Agency to go and enforce the law as it currently stands. For example, the chalk streams are predominantly affected by two primary things. One is over abstraction. The law was changed. The law used to be that if the Environment Agency revoked a water company's abstraction license, they would have to compensate the water company. That law was changed 6 years ago. That if that abstraction is causing serious damage to that river, the Environment Agency can revoke that license without compensating the water company.
Right.
You want to take a guess how many water company licenses have been revoked directly as a result of causing serious damage to the environment?
I'm going to hazard a guess, say none, but you can...
Correct. None. So the law is there. The law is quite clear.
Yeah.
And there is no cost to the Environment Agency. As it turns out, the UK was taken to the European Court of Justice in 2012 by the European Commission for breaching the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, i.e. we're talking about dumping sewage into England's rivers.
Yeah.
And the European Commission had an issue with the UK. The European Court of Justice ruled that the UK was non-compliant with the directive. In plain English, the UK was breaking the law. The court also ruled that this should only ever be contemplated in, and I am quoting, exceptional circumstances. We now know last year water companies in England spent over 1.5 million hours dumping sewage into rivers in England. Can someone please tell me, 8 years after the European Court of Justice ruled it should only ever happen in exceptional circumstances, what was exceptional about over 1.5 million hours?
It's incredible when you look at the stats and the figures. So have you got a theory behind why they do it? This because no one's challenging them? They just think they can get away with it? Or
quite simply for me, it boils down to a very simple thing. The Environment Agency are failing to deliver on their statutory obligations. The board and the senior management have proved time and time again, and today is the most damning indictment if ever one were needed, that the Environment Agency has become nothing more than a hotbed of mediocrity and incompetence. And
there are some organisations, not NGOs predominantly, that are kind of fighting the good fight. I think you're a supporter of salmon and trout conservation. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And Nick and his team have been doing a phenomenal job. And it's now quite clear that discussing this with the Environment Agency, people have been doing for 30 years, has proved utterly ineffectual. And I can't go into the details of it at the minute, but it became apparent in the public domain yesterday that I have now put a crack legal team together, and we will now be taking a very different approach from the one that has been taken historically.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, that people just neglect the rivers, and if these organisations that are meant to be protecting them aren't living up to their mandate, then it's good to know that people like yourself and Salmon and Trout Conservation are putting them to task.
Well, listen, we shouldn't have to. That's the job.
No, exactly.
The Environment Agency.
Yeah. That's the shame, isn't it?
The Environment Agency was given a clear instruction by Parliament to protect, maintain, and develop these rivers. Well, here we are today. We know there is not a single river in England that meets good overall environmental status. Not one.
Yeah.
Almost 30 years after the Environment Agency was established. So would they like to explain to me what they've been doing for 30 years to protect, maintain, and develop these rivers?
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like it.
It doesn't sound like they've done a lot, does it, from when you look at the stats and the figures? And are you seeing this on, because you mentioned that is the Lee your local river? That's your...
It is. The Amon Magna fishery, we own fishing and repairing rights in 2.5 miles of the River Lee.
And you're seeing the same problems that you mentioned on there, are you?
Well, the Amon Magna fishery is slightly different position.
Okay.
In that what got me into all of this. In the late 1990s, the club made a complaint to the Environment Agency where water seemed to be disappearing out of the river. The flow seemed to be dropping quite remarkably. That, as it transpired, began this 12, 13-year circular conversation between the Environment Agency, the club, and Thames Water. And it was only when I became chairman that I began to push harder to find out what was going on, to discover that a report actually had been written in 2003, identifying exactly what the problem was, how to fix it, and nobody had ever acted upon it. So working with Fish Legal, the Amon Magna and myself and Fish Legal, we spent probably a year and a half prepping a case to take the Environment Agency to the High Court. Thankfully, at the last minute, we managed to resolve the water issue. We now have our flow back. It is behaving in a reasonably good fashion. Has it come on leaps and bounds over the last 5 years? Absolutely, without question.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, one of the easy tests that you can do to a river is to simply test for the level of phosphate in a river.
Okay.
So during those recent quite heavy rainstorms we had, we were seeing phosphate levels of 0.76, 0.79 per milligram per litre, when in a healthy river, it should be less than something like 0.05.
Right.
Let me say again, we were seeing levels of 0.76.
So definitely more than they should have been.
As we now know today, the Amon Magna is not unusual because every single river in the country has failed a chemical test. Every single river.
And that's the thing, isn't it? When you're working, whether you walk your dog along the river, or you're fishing on the river, you get to know every inch of it, and you know if something's not right. And it's almost like, I don't want to sound too romanticizing, but they become a bit like a friend in a way if you're along a river all the time. So you become quite protective. I live close to the Trent and some of the tributaries of the Trent. Yeah, I know pretty well. And there is some massive water quality issues, and you want to correct those, but it's difficult when you're a one-man band. So it's great to see, like you say, you're trying to change something to these river systems, particularly local ones, but all over.
Bear with me 1 second, because I did a whole series of tweets the other day about the River Trent. Oh yeah.
Oh, did you?
I did. So, for example, if somebody wants to go and have a look at my Twitter feed, you will see on August the 31st, I posted 2 little pictures, one showing every sewage overflow upstream of the National Canoe Centre in Nottingham.
Yes, yeah, I know it.
And I can now tell you that upstream, the storm sewage overflows in 2019 spent a grand total of 15,921 hours dumping sewage into the River Trent upstream from the National Canoe Centre. That's the equivalent of 663 full days worth of sewage.
Jesus.
Now you want to tell me that the River Trent's got some water quality issues?
When you see a turd passing you by when you're canoeing or something like that, it's not Doesn't fill you with much enthusiasm, does it?
And that change in the chemical status of the river then impacts upon invariably the whole ecology of the river, the plant life, the ecosystems, the kinds of plants that will grow there, the kinds of invertebrate and insects that will then feed on those plants and be able to reproduce, and therefore the kind of fish life. To give you a very simple example, one of the primary indicators of a good, healthy looking chalk stream is ranunculus.
Yes, yeah.
It's very, very particular about the quality of water it's prepared to grow in and about the velocity and speed that that water is moving at. Now, if you can get ranunculus grown in your river, as I frequently call it, that to an invertebrate is a 5-star hotel with a 3-star Michelin restaurant attached. You get the ranunculus, you're going to get the invertebrates, you'll get the trout, and you'll get the grayling.
Yeah.
It's a simple idea, and all based on a single plant. I absolutely guarantee you, upstream on the River Trent, I would be really amazed and delighted if there was a single blade of ranunculus anywhere near 663 days worth of sewage being dumped into that river.
I can't, I'm born and bred in Nottingham. I can't ever think of ever seeing ranunculus in the Trent, so I'd have to agree with that. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of it in there. Someone was telling me, I don't know if you've had much experience with pearl mussels, but they are meant to be the height of water quality. I don't think you get them in chalk streams, but in some of the upland rivers, they cannot live. I think they can only live in rivers even better than the highest quality that we have, and they're struggling a little bit, but we've got a few hanging on. But if you've got them, you know that the rivers is about as good as it can be if you've got mussels in.
All right. Well,
in there.
It's a valid point, because something that's overlooked in this whole conversation about the Water Framework Directive and good status. Good status, by the way, is actually only kind of passable. There is another categorization, and that is high.
Yes. Yeah.
So on the basis that there's no river actually meets good overall status, we can assume that there's also no river gets anywhere close to being high overall environmental status.
No, which is a little bit depressing when I think about this podcast. So I think I should probably try and end it on a relatively high note. So what I will say is, where have you been fishing at the moment?
Well, I'm off up the Amal Magna, because obviously the trout season generically ends at the end of September.
Yes, yeah.
As we head in towards the end of the year, November, December, Mummy and Daddy Trout tend to do what Mummy and Daddy Trout want to do. So tomorrow might well possibly be my last day.
Okay.
I'm heading up to the Amal Magna fishery with a couple of friends. In recent weeks, I've been down on the Kennet and down on the Itching, down on the Test. And I'm lucky enough that I get around quite a bit and get to fish some of the more interesting looking rivers in this country. Yeah. The thing, if you will listen, to end in a high, for me, what days like today does is now simply clarify what those of us that have an interest in these rivers, what we now need to go and do. So if I would suggest to anybody, don't ever get depressed about it. Don't get sad about it. Don't get overwhelmed about it. Get bloody angry, get motivated, and get out there and change it. That's all I'm doing.
So if people listening to this podcast, they feel moved to do something, what can they do to try and make a difference?
Write to your local MP.
Yeah.
And when you've done that, then write to the Secretary of State. And when you've done that, write to the Minister for Water. And when you've done that, write to the Minister for the Environment. And when you've done that, write to the Prime Minister. And when you've run through that list, get back to me. I'll give you some more.
I think we'll get our pens ready and see if we can get something done. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Feargal, and hopefully that's kind of given people an insight into our rivers.
Pleasure's all mine, and thank you for the invitation.